have to talk about, if we're going to talk about the possibility of, or the obligation of AI perhaps handling all ways of speaking all language, is issues of data and something called data sovereignty, which relates to privacy, and something referred to as IPR, which stands for intellectual property rights, and related issues like that, copyright and so forth. Because if you don't already know, you should know by the end of this class now that modern AI, our statistical models that we use, are highly dependent on having access to data and lots of it. So where is that data coming from? Is it being handled in a correct way? All right, so if we're going to talk about AI handling all the different ways we can speak all the different languages, we have to talk in terms of how much training data is available for each of those variations. And then we have to talk about where does that data come from. So if we go back and think about engrams in generating models, such as what large language models do, you can see 3 examples of pretty well readable texts that were generated, not by a large language model, but by an engram model. And you can see, if you read those 3, the first one, they also point to $99.6 billion from 204.063% of the rate of interest stores as Mexico and Gram, Brazil, on market conditions. Well, that one we can tell is probably not a highly developed one. That might be a bigram model, so it's not that readable. But it should be clear what the data source is, or what it's not. It's clearly not from fiction. Most likely this is one of the more famous data sources, early data sources for NLP in English, the Wall Street Journal corpus, talking about financial stuff primarily in numbers. And that's where the data came from, so that's what the model generates. As opposed to the second one, this shall forbid it, should be branded if renown made it empty. Now, where would you guess that data comes from if it's generating that random sentence? Shakespeare, maybe? And then if you look at the last one, you are uniformly charming, cried he, with a smile of associating, and now and then I bowed, and they perceived a chase and for to wish for. What exactly is the source? I don't know, but it's pretty clear, probably fiction. All fiction, probably all fiction, definitely a lot of fiction in there. So as a reminder, what your technology is able to do is highly dependent on the amount of data it has of all the variations of the language and the genre and source. So this applies then to different ways of speaking a language. So African American vernacular English, it's known that most speech technology does not handle African American vernacular English very well. You got to get the data, right? There's a representation, for example, on Twitter on how people who speak that dialect or that variety of English would represent how they actually speak. If we have that representation, then we can train the model. If we don't have it, or if we don't have enough, it's not going to be able to handle it. It can't adjust to these variations like our ears and brains can. And English, this is the world, international language. There's not one English. There's not even 2 English. You might think of American and British English, but let me assure you, some scientists don't even talk about English. They talk about Englishes, all the different varieties and variations and standards of English, because it's a national language in many countries around the world. So in Nigeria, there's an example of Nigerian English. And I don't speak Nigerian English, but I can see some things that are different from my dialect. Not to mention just the text speech there, right, where the letters are used instead of words. Are you a wizard? Or what gone self? In the morning, you tweet. Afternoon, you tweet. What gone in the tweet? Beta, get your IT placement with Twitter. I don't know if my accent was correct at all, but that's what the spelling indicates, perhaps. And I've heard some Nigerian English speakers. It's different. How is they going to handle that? Well, it depends on the data size and the source. So you have to think about that, and then you have to think about where's that data coming from, and how is it being used. So we can think back to Eliza as an example, just as an early example of why these issues are important. The earliest chatbot. First of all, we saw that people became very deeply emotionally involved with this chatbot, which even sometimes they themselves had a part in building. They knew it was just a computer taking some rules of the words they were typing in and changing them around. Nothing personal at all, not very intelligent either, even less intelligent perhaps than our models today. But they got to the point where they wanted even as they were typing in, they wanted other people in the room to leave because they were entering presumably private stuff into this model, into this NLP tool. And then we saw that, and what we didn't talk about earlier that's worthy of note is that when the scientist who was in charge of this suggested to his coworkers that they might be a good idea to store all this data, get this input so they could make the model better, so it could analyze these conversations that they were having, these people, and this was in the 1960s, before the internet and all of that, they immediately brought up questions of privacy implications. If people are putting in their language into a model that's public or they paid for it, does the people who own it have the right to use it? What's the implications for privacy? So this is something that's been around for a while, and we don't have a definite answer, but it is something we have to consider. And add to that, then, if you're speaking a language that is not supported by schools, that's not a national language, and in some cultures, language is more of a spiritual experience. It's very connected to spiritual experiences or even to relationships, such that, for example, it's considered wrong to listen to the voice of someone who's dead. When someone dies, you should not look at their picture or hear their voice. And so that brings up some sensitive issues that we don't deal with in our culture and our language. And then if it's a minority language, it's the only data available. What if it's a politically sensitive context where they might be risk getting in trouble or being seen as a threat or an enemy to the national government? So if they're talking about things and there's content that they happen to have been recorded speaking about that might be politically sensitive, and that data becomes public and gets associated to their name in a country where there maybe isn't as much respect for due process, it's more than an issue of data privacy. And those things become even more of an issue when you're dealing with minority cultures or marginalized cultures, or just communities that don't have as much data accessible to them or as many speakers to create the data as English does. Every bit of language data and every story becomes valuable. So what do you do about that, and how do you consider it? These are all issues that are going to come up when we think about language technology for a wide variety of languages.